I want to get back onto the issue of immigration. Now, it's the big story of the day, and quite frankly, it's hugely relevant both in economic terms and in terms of what sort of country we want to be. As you know, I'm pro-migration. We are, of course, a migrant country. But for too long, we've been using migration to artificially inflate our budget. Now, to be fair, both sides of politics have certainly been guilty of this. You'd have to go back to the Howard and Abbott governments to find a time where we boosted migration, but not at the cost of the quality of life for everyone already here. And it's that quality of life point that I think is why I have long supported a fair income review into our migration system, but alongside that, a proper population plan. But today, unfortunately, we got neither of these two things, given one of the biggest objectives of this review was skills for a net zero economy. And as I showed you a little earlier, a point-blank refusal by the minister to even answer questions on our population trajectory. Now, to dig into some of the detail that was released today, I'm joined now by Tehan, former Minister for Trade and Tourism in the previous government, and now, of course, Shadow Minister for Immigration and Citizenship. Tehan, welcome. Before we get into specifics, what was your top-line assessment of today's report?
Well, I think it's just a continuation of the government's Big Australia by stealth. There is no plan. There is no detail. They don't talk about the economic cost of net overseas migration increasing by 650,000 in the next 2 years, plus what was announced today. Adding to that, what is the impact when it comes to inflation, which will increase interest rates? The Reserve Bank have raised this question. What's the impact on housing? How are young people going to be able to own their own home? It became harder with the lack of detail here and the increase in the numbers when it comes to immigration, when it comes to rents, when it comes to congestion. There's just no plan when it comes to this government. They've had 10 months, they've commissioned a review, and most parts of the review, they've now said, oh, we'll decide and we'll agree to the recommendations or not agree to the recommendations by the end of the year. And that number of 650,000 is just going to continue to grow in that time.
Yeah, I think the 650 is all about having a number in the budget to sort of wind up artificial growth. But in GDP terms, as individuals, of course, we're worse off. The bottom line in the budget might look better, but living in communities and cities that are already congested, it's not going to be easier. And of course, you make a good point there. A lot of what you put on the table today means we will be bigger in migrant terms than the 650 already announced, and a big lift too out of New Zealand. We're going to have a bigger population than she's letting on, aren't we?
We are, and she sort of got very defensive about that right at the end of her speech, and almost just to sort of say, oh, well, we don't really want a big Australia, even though everything we're doing is going to lead that. And what I could not understand also was why she did all this when the immigration minister is overseas. There doesn't seem to be any coordination between her, Clare O'Neil, the Home Affairs Minister, and the Immigration Minister. And a lot of the questions she was asked by the journalists, she said, oh, well, we'll have to wait for Andrew Giles to return from overseas to answer that. The whole thing was very ad hoc. I think once again just showed that they've got no real plan, and all they want to do is say, look over here, while they increase the number of immigrants who come into this country. There was no figures around what workforce shortages have been addressed in the last 12 months. That when she was asked what they're going to do about the aged care sector and nurses in particular for our aged care residences, she said, oh, you'll have to ask Andrew Giles. All these things which you would think you would be able to answer by now, there was just no response on.
And to you, the point about Pacific Island workers, she flicked that to Penny Wong and the Foreign Affairs portfolio. She said it had nothing to do with her either. I thought there was a lack of clarity on the issue of skills. I mean, on one hand, she argued we needed to use migration to bring in the best and the brightest, or retain, if they're here studying, the best and the brightest. But on the other hand, you're right, you're talking there about nurses. She was arguing we need more temporary migrants to stay here those that are working in ag jobs or cleaners, hospitality staff, etc. She said they need to be here permanently or given a pathway to be here permanently. I couldn't see what the objective underlying the government's migration policy was. Are we for the best and the brightest, or do we want low-skilled workers in here on a permanent basis?
That's right, and they said they're going to review the skills list. Yet, when is the review going to take place? How long are we going to wait? I mean, there will be employers who are waiting to see the outcome of that. They said that they're going to lift the TISMET, the rate that you have to employ migrants by 70,000, yet no detail on the potential impact, especially in regional and rural Australia, that might have, because that's where a lot of our aged care facilities, the care economy and other employers employ people at the older number, which was around $54,000. So they potentially have a one-off hit in wages of about $16,000. No economic modelling on that, the type of workforce shortages that might exacerbate. And then when it comes to the Pacific Islands, I just thought it was absolutely damning that she couldn't answer that question. In the report itself, it says that the scheme that Labor have put in place is going to lead to the Pacific Islanders losing the skilled workers that they need. Now, the whole idea of the Pacific strategy is to build the Pacific up, and yet their program, in that report, it says there's a real fear it'll do the opposite. And she couldn't even answer that simple question. They've had the report for 2 months. She's going to the press club. All she could say is, oh, you'll need to speak to Penny Wong and Pat Conroy about that. I just thought that was completely damning.
Yeah, your point there, so people at home can follow you, is that we bring people from our region to Australia to do jobs. We know a lot of them send the money home. They skill themselves up. They've got an Australian employer on their CV. Then they go home and transfer those skills to the Solomon Islands or wherever they're from and build up their local capacity. Otherwise, we're creaming off their best and brightest and keeping them here. We're doing nothing to help our region. One of the things I thought, Dan, was, why aren't we doing more to get the million or so Australians on the dole into real jobs? And of course, why aren't we training some of our own young people for the skills shortages the Minister says that are here, rather than bringing people in constantly from overseas?
Well, a really good question. And of course, we heard nothing about that. And we heard nothing when it comes to, for instance, our higher education system, our universities, who are bringing in the international students. But where is the focus on making sure that we're educating young Australians so that they can fill those skills in our universities? Where's the focus on making sure that we're getting the scientists, or we're training up the nurses that we need, or the teachers? There was none of that. So there's just a complete lack of planning to make sure that we're doing what we need to do as a country to build the skills that we need, but also where we do have those shortages, to use our immigration system to address them. Just this, it's a very, what I think is basically a lazy approach of just saying, well, we'll bring as many people in as we possibly can, and then hopefully that scattergun approach might fill and address some of those workforce shortages. Yet there is no proof that that's actually occurring.